Hey everybody! For today's Jane Eyre adaptation comparison, we're talking about heartache and humiliation. Yay! The material we're going to look at comes from chapters 16 and 17 of the book. There are a few different things that go on in these chapters. Jane spends a lot of time trying to determine her feelings for Rochester and fruitlessly trying to talk herself out of them, while also trying to figure out what's the deal with Gray's pool. If she's the one who set fire to Rochester's room, as he said, then why is she still employed there? There's something strange going on. But for the purposes of keeping this video at least somewhat organized, I'm going to focus mainly on three things: the arrival of the guests for Rochester's house party, Blanche Ingram, and the staircase scene. But first, a little summary. Jane wakes the morning after the fire and she's all shook up. She wants to see Rochester, she doesn't want to see Rochester. She's just a bundle of chaotic, wild feelings, and she has a million questions, but she's left hanging because it turns out Rochester left first thing in the morning to go to a house party. Mrs. Fairfax doesn't expect he'll come back for a long time, but after a fortnight he sends word that he's bringing the party to Thornfield. Among the guests is the Honorable Blanche Ingram, who Mrs. Fairfax expects Rochester will eventually marry. On the second night of the guest's stay, Rochester sends a message insisting that Jane come downstairs with Adele. Reluctantly, Jane complies, hiding herself as much as possible in the window seat. From there, she observes all the fine ladies and gentlemen, but especially Blanche. Blanche is beautiful and clever, but Jane finds her to be quite self-conscious. Blanche is clearly making a play for Rochester, but though he plays the flirtatious game and does nothing to dispel the rumors that he and Blanche are a thing, Jane can see that he doesn't really love her. This makes things all the more painful for Jane. She's been making a concerted effort to not fall in love with him. She's gone through all the reasons why it can't and won't happen, and spared nothing in her own self-criticism. But it's all for nothing, because the moment he walks in that room, she's lost the war. She loves him, and there's nothing she can do to stop it. Either Blanche has a sixth sense that Jane is her romantic rival, or she just hates the lower classes, but she introduces the subject of governesses. Jane is forced to sit there in humiliated silence as some of the guests say awful things about her profession and, by insinuation, about her own character. The breaking point comes, however, when Blanche invites Rochester to sing while she plays the piano. The strain is just too much, and Jane escapes from the room, only to have Rochester catch up to her on the staircase. This little interview is almost unbearable for Jane, who's on the verge of tears. Finally, after way too many questions, Rochester lets her go and bids her good night, almost letting slip a term of endearment. I assume that's what it was. He says "good night, my," and then breaks off. Not sure what he was going to say exactly, but the possibilities made my 13-year-old heart flutter. Unfortunately, none of the major film or miniseries adaptations include this line. The only version that has it, if I remember correctly, is, of all things, the 1949 version with Charlton Heston. Now for the adaptations. Since I am not just talking about one scene, but rather a series of scenes, or a section, there's a lot to cover, and I'm warning you right now that I'm not going to be able to cover everything. There's going to be some stuff that I just don't get to mention. I can't do a thorough analysis of all the things, but I'm going to do my best to hit the highlights. Starting with 1934. 1934. This version is a little off in its interpretation of all scenes, but here the writers were especially inventive. Adele falls into a vase, and Jane has to smash it to get her out. Jane and Rochester dance. Rochester steps out for a consultation with his lawyer. Adele entertains the older gentleman with comic imitations of the guests. It's all over the place. About the only things they got right is that the Blanche character has dark hair, and Rochester does order Jane to come down to the party. For the rest, they just do their own thing. It's all pretty unusual for a Jane Eyre production, but I'd be lying if I said that the whole thing wasn't a little bit amusing. 1944 is much more my speed. I would like to mention that before the guest's arrival, there's a super spooky scene where Jane goes up to the forbidden wing and hears a chilling scream, and instead of confronting Grace Poole confronts her. This being one of the more stylish cinematic versions, it's a little more polished, with some nicely framed shots. Blanche, played by Hilary Brooke, is a rather magnificent woman with an affinity for feathers. She's not as mean as she could be, but she's still a snob, and she still succeeds in wounding Jane. I always feel her pain so deeply in this moment, and Fontaine knew how to cry compelling tears. I do love the way Rochester comes up behind her and takes the doorknob here. Hey, it's the little things. I think this might be one of my favorite scenes of this Jane and Rochester together. Fontaine and Wells are both great here, in my opinion. Their moment, however, is unfortunately interrupted by the arrival of Mason, leading to the "I wish I were on a quiet island alone with only you" dialogue. Now, the 1970 version really surprised me. It gets a lot of small details that, honestly, I wouldn't have expected to see. The day after the fire, Jane puts on a light printed dress and spends a little more time in front of her mirror in anticipation of seeing Rochester again. After finding out he's left, it's back to plain old black. Blanche, played by Nairi Dawn Porter, is dark-haired and wears the purple riding habit with the plume. It's one of 4 versions to include that purple riding habit, though 2 others have her wearing black or burgundy. She calls Rochester Signor Eduardo, and Rochester sings, though I'm 99% sure Scott is dubbed. And I think it's the only one besides 2006 that has Jane and Adele looking down on the party from the gallery on the first night. I'm more than a little shocked to say this because I've never considered 1970 my favorite in any category, but I really love how they did this whole section. York's acting is especially expressive. The whole time she's listening to him sing, I'm just like, I feel your pain! And then she rushes out of the room, and Rochester rushes after her, and she's like, no, please, I can't take it. And I love how Rochester talks to her on the stairs. Scott, who tends to be a gruff Rochester anyway, and not a favorite of mine, could so easily have been imperious with her here as some other Rochesters are. But instead, his speech is softened and so much more sympathetic. And then after he lets her go, we see him start heading back to the party, but stop and turn around and go somewhere else instead, as if without Jane there, he doesn't feel like going back in. Good stuff. There are 2 things the 1973 version has that stand out for me. One is Blanche, played by Stephanie Beacham, who seems to have walked straight out of the book. Physically, she's just right, and temperamentally, well, she's the worst. She's judgmental, showy, insulting, and yes, self-conscious. She seems to single Jane out from the beginning, and she's almost ruthless in her cruelty, as well as in her attempts to secure Rochester's attention. This is also one of the few versions where Blanche gets to go on her rant about young men of today being too obsessed with their looks, that women should be the beautiful ones while men go off and do manly things. I've always found this rant a little random, but it's just another calculated effort to attract Rochester. Interestingly, this is also one of the few versions that shows how rude not just Blanche Ingram is, but her mother and brother as well. The other great thing in this version is this moment when Rochester's singing, where he sees Jane get up out of the corner of his eye and smoothly and surreptitiously angles himself around the piano to watch her leave. By the way, this is the only version to have Rochester sing the Corsair song, as done in the book, and one of only 3 versions where Rochester sings at all, and I believe Jaston is the only one who does his own singing, so props to him. There's nothing particular about this staircase scene that jumps out at me, except that this Rochester is up to his old tricks, constantly shifting his tone from playful to demanding, and for once, Jane isn't okay with it. This Jane is good-natured all the time, and the way she protests that she's tired really conveys how discouraged and depressed she is. Surprisingly, I like 1983's interpretation of these scenes a little less than usual. This is such a faithful adaptation, but now and then the writers throw some changes in there. One addition here that I don't like is that Jane manages to catch Rochester just before he leaves Thornfield. She questions why Grace Poole is still in his employment, asking if she has some hold over him, and he tells her, basically, to mind her own business. Frankly, I'm with Rochester on this one. He's secretive and squirrely, but this is an impertinent question for someone in her position to ask. And while in the book Jane did wonder about it, I don't think she would have gone so far as to interrogate her employer. I also think it's interesting, and this is not something that I don't like, that in this one, during the party, Jane seems not just hurt, but also just plain disgusted. She has good reason. These high society people aren't exactly exhibits of strong moral character, and this Blanche, again a brunette, is extremely rude. When Mrs. Fairfax welcomes her to Thornfield, she stares at her like, "How dare you address me, you lowly servant woman?" And she seems to be in a state of constant, barely concealed annoyance. Again, I don't really have anything to say about the staircase scene. It's fine. I would like to point out, though, that this is the only version where Rochester is able to detain her on the stairs because she stopped to fix her shoe, as in the book. Thanks for the attention to detail, 1983. One of the things I always remember about the 1996 film is the mirror scene. It's a prime example of how an adaptation can condense pages of narration into a solitary shot, little or no dialogue needed. Jane, after hearing about the beautiful Blanche, passes a mirror in the hall and stops to gaze dispassionately at her reflection. It's very simple, but very effective. I'm not always a fan of Gainsbourg in this role, but I think she does a fine job in these melancholy scenes, especially on the stairs. And on the whole, as I've been doing these comparisons, I've been liking her and Hurt's performances more than I ever did before. The venom of the governess conversation is diluted a little by this interaction between Lady Ingram and the other woman, I think it's Mrs. Eshton, which always makes me laugh.
Have I said something wrong? She is sitting just behind you. Who is? The governess. Oh. Well, never mind.
But on a more serious note, I really appreciate Adele's discomfort in this moment. She's just a child, but even she knows these people are being rude and unfeeling. In these scenes, Adele is usually so distracted with the attention and the pretty ladies that she doesn't realize what Jane might be going through. She seems much more aware here. The 1997 version, well, once again, I'm not very happy with it. We start off with a very flushed Jane whose voiceover tells us how badly she wants to see Rochester. When she finds out he's gone, she fires a series of questions at Mrs. Fairfax about where he is and what he's doing and when he'll be back, and she's so obvious. It's embarrassing. Stop giving yourself away, Jane. Where's your poker face? Where's your self-respect? I don't think they got Blanche quite right either. My first impression is that she's not unpleasant, which makes it easy to understand why Mrs. Fairfax goes on about how wonderful she is. Plus, she's nice to Adele, at least on the outside. Jane gets up and leaves the party as soon as the governess discussion starts, which is really too early. Not that I want her to have to sit and suffer through any more than that, but it's just the way it's supposed to be. Rochester follows her out, and in response to his order to come back, she retorts, "To be insulted?" Ooh, let's compare that with Jane's decorum and self-control in the book. On page 182, Rochester has just asked, "Why did you not come and speak to me in the room?" I thought I might have retorted the question on him who put it, meaning, "Why didn't you come and speak to me in the room?" But I would not take that freedom. I answered, "I did not wish to disturb you, as you seemed engaged, sir." Rochester says, "Return to the drawing room. You're deserting too early." Jane says, "I'm tired, sir." She does not say, "To be insulted?" And I don't like the way this scene ends at all. Instead of closing on a tender, quieter note, Rochester shouts up the stairs after her that she better be back there tomorrow night and all the nights afterward. Ugh. I do like that Jane's voiceover talks about loving Rochester in spite of his numerous faults, and I think it's interesting the way they crossfade into different activities happening in the room, representing multiple nights of the guest's visit. One of these has Blanche and Rochester singing a duet. I'm pretty sure Hines is dubbed, which is weird because I've heard him sing, and his real voice would have sounded more natural than the singer dubbing him, who has a much higher voice. As many things as there are that I love about the 2006 version, the guest sequence is not exactly one of them. For starters, Adele irritates me to no end. Granted, I find this Adele annoying most of the time anyway, but especially here. I don't care for the addition of these twins either, and the discussion of the book, The Beast Within, strikes me as painfully obvious symbolism. That said, I do give this one the award for Best Guests, and by best, I mean worst. Christina Cole makes a good Blanche, entitled and calculating, but, well, she's blonde, and also, snobby as she is, she's not quite rude enough. But her mother sure makes up for that. Few other versions give Lady Ingram more than a line or two, but this version builds her part up a lot, possibly because they got Francesca Annis to play the role. Even Rochester seems disturbed at how nasty the governess discussion gets. He knows Jane is being hurt, and he knows it's his fault she's there to hear their abuse. I do like the stairs scene in this one, where Rochester presses so hard for an explanation and is like, I know you're crying, I can see you're crying, why are you crying? And Jane is about to burst into tears from the pressure. I do find, though, that the guest scenes tend to go on a bit long. Instead of the book's game of charades, which a couple versions do include, there's a scene where Jane and Lady Ingram get testy over child psychology and discipline, and there's a sequence that builds up the supernatural mood with talk of ghosts, flashes of lightning, and shenanigans over a Ouija board. I give them credit for trying so many new things, but none of this does much for me, though they did find a creative way to liken Lady Ingram to Jane's Aunt Reed. Still, I confess these scenes, brief as they are, often make me feel restless. Going back a bit, though, this version does do a fine job in the post-fire period, first with the confrontation with Grace Poole, and second with Jane's inner turmoil over her feelings for Rochester. Mrs. Fairfax unknowingly does huge damage to Jane's already brittle self-esteem, causing Jane to retreat to her room and paint the portraits of herself and of Blanche, something we only see in one other version, 1973. We even see her writing up an advertisement for a new position. This whole part is very well done and true to the book. Last but not least, we have the 2011 version, which finds yet another new way of handling this part of the story. I think this one also does a good job depicting the angsty period of Rochester's absence with a montage in which we see Jane pacing restlessly in the snow and trying to focus on teaching, and Adele notices her hand shaking. I believe there's also an allusion to Jane's self-debasing self-portrait. The guests as a whole don't leave a strong impression on me, and at first neither does this Blanche, played by Imogen Poots. But not long into the scene, she takes over the conversation, and then I change my mind. She's not as naturally imposing or as vivacious as other Blanches, but she is watchful and artificial in a way that I feel really hits on that self-consciousness that Jane perceives in the book. She is also only the second Blanche to go on the male beauty rant, in spite of the fact that her singing isn't the strongest. All this, plus her dark hair, makes her, for me, the second most accurate Blanche Ingram. As for the staircase dialogue, which doesn't take place on a staircase in this one, I like the way the actors interpret it, though this movie closely imitates the 44 version, with Jane and Rochester interrupted prematurely with news of Mason's arrival. Their conversation then transitions into the one about loyalty that would have taken place after the gypsy scene had they included it. Much as I do miss the gypsy scene, I don't mind the seamless way they rearranged this. So, to summarize, I think 2006 had the most excruciating and memorable guests. I think 1973 had the most accurate Blanche, with 2011 coming in second. I don't think I have a favorite staircase scene, but whichever one I would put in first place, I'd probably put 1944 in second place, but I think I enjoyed 1970 the most overall. Surprise! Next up is the gypsy scene. Woo! There are only like 3 of them, but whatever, I'm gonna milk it. I hope you enjoyed this comparison. I know this isn't exactly the exciting stuff that people like to talk about when they're talking Jane Eyre adaptations, but I couldn't skip it. And besides, this is important because this is where Jane realizes she's in love, not just a little, but passionately. And because she has no hope of a relationship with Rochester, and it looks like he's going to marry someone else, it's a love that seems doomed to be unrequited. And you know what I always say? I'm a sucker for unrequited love. If you have a preference for one version or another with regard to these scenes, go ahead and share your thoughts in the comments down below. I'm always interested to hear what you all have to say, so go on and discuss it to your heart's content. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching!